Three K9 puppies, barely old enough to stand tied to a tree deep in the Flagstaff woods. No food, no water, bones showing through fur, no bark, no cry, just silence and fear. Cars passed, no one stopped, until a broken ex-firefighter did. Jack Miller had seen flames take lives, but he never expected to find hope whimpering at the end of a rope. What he did next will break your heart and piece it back together. Before we begin, tell me where are you watching from. Drop your country in the comments. Let's see how far their story reaches. The morning sun hung low over Flagstaff, Arizona. Its golden light filtered through the pale fog that clung stubbornly to the treetops of Evergreen Hill. The crispness in the mountain air hinted at winter's approach, even as autumn's last leaves clung to life. A soft breeze stirred pine needles on the forest floor, and carried with it a sound almost too faint to hear unless you were listening. Emily Carson was listening. 12 years old, wiry and quick-footed Emily had the kind of curious energy that adults found both admirable and exhausting. Her long auburn hair was always pulled into a messy ponytail that danced as she ran, and her freckled face was marked by permanent expressions of wonder or defiance depending on the moment. She wore a hand-me-down army green parka, 2 sizes too big a gift from her uncle, and boots scuffed from years of climbing everything that dared her. That morning, she had wandered off the trail while walking home from the library. It wasn't unusual for her to detour. Books were nice, but mysteries were better, and the woods behind her neighborhood always seemed to whisper secrets. She paused near a thicket where the ground dipped slightly into a hollow framed by pine trunks twisted with age. That's when she heard it a sound like wind at first, until it came again. A whimper, soft, reedy, not wind. Emily crouched, her heart thudding louder than the sound itself. She crept forward, careful not to snap twigs beneath her boots. As she pushed aside a curtain of overgrowth, the sight made her breath catch in her throat. There, tied to a crooked pine tree with what looked like frayed baling twine, were 3 German shepherd puppies. They were impossibly small, no more than 6 or 7 weeks old, with ribs like piano keys, and fur clumped with dirt and sap. One of them, a dark-coated pup with oversized paws and a patch of white on his chest, lifted his head at her arrival and whimpered again. The others huddled close to him, one sandy brown and the other more gray-black, trembling so badly they looked like leaves caught in a breeze. Emily's first instinct was to run to them, but when she took a step forward, the gray-black pup growled weakly and jerked away, tugging the rope tighter around his neck. She stopped, cold tears stinging the corners of her eyes. "It's okay," she whispered, lowering herself to her knees. "I won't hurt you." But even at 12, Emily knew kindness wasn't enough when bones were showing and eyes were sinking. She needed help. She turned and bolted back through the trees, feet pounding earth and heart racing faster than her breath. The hill behind her house sloped into the edge of town, and her sneakers hit pavement with a slap as she rounded the corner toward the yellow-painted house that belonged to her uncle. Jack Miller had just returned from his morning shift, helping an old friend patch a leaking barn roof. He stood barefoot in the doorway of his modest 1-story home, holding a mug of coffee and wearing a faded gray t-shirt stained with old paint. Jack was in his early 40s, tall and broad-shouldered, with calloused hands, and the permanent sunburn of a man who spent more time outside than in. A thick beard peppered with gray made him look older than he was. Since leaving the Flagstaff Fire Department 3 years earlier, after a warehouse collapse left him with a torn shoulder, and nightmares, he had retreated into a life of solitude and odd jobs. Uncle Jack Emily shouted breathless as she skidded to a stop on the gravel drive. Jack raised an eyebrow. "What is it, dogs? Puppies. In the woods. Someone tied them up. They're dying." Her voice trembled with urgency, and the mug in Jack's hand paused mid-air. He didn't ask questions. Didn't say, "Are you sure?" or maybe someone's coming back for them. He simply set the mug down, grabbed the coat hanging by the door, and followed her. Back in the hollow, the puppies hadn't moved much. When Jack stepped into the clearing, his entire body tensed. He crouched beside them, eyes narrowing as he examined the frayed rope and the way it bit into their necks. "Who the hell would do this?" he muttered. Emily stood back, chewing her bottom lip, watching the big man, who rarely spoke more than necessary, handle the puppies with a gentleness that surprised her. Jack pulled a pocket knife from his jeans and carefully sliced through the ropes one by one, murmuring softly. The pups collapsed into his arms. Blitz, the dark-coated one, tried to growl again, but gave up and rested his head against Jack's chest. Hazel, the sandy one, whimpered as her tiny body sagged. Duke, the gray-black one with the white chest, didn't make a sound, just stared at Emily with dark, unblinking eyes. Jack scooped all three up, adjusting them in his arms like fragile glass. "We'll figure this out," he said. Emily nodded, tears finally falling freely. She reached out and touched Hazel's paw. "I'm sorry, people are so mean," she whispered. As they made their way back up the hill, the wind picked up slightly. Clouds gathered over Evergreen Hill, casting shadows on the path. But there was something in the way the puppies nestled against Jack and the way Emily walked close behind him like a guardian of guardians that made the forest feel less cold. They didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning. Not just of rescue, but of reckoning. The house sat at the edge of an open clearing, a weathered one-story structure with chipped green paint and a slanted roof patched more times than Jack could count. The backyard opened to the woods like an invitation to nowhere, framed by rusted fencing and scattered firewood. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine cleaner and old smoke, the scent of a man who used to live among fire and never fully left it behind. Jack laid the three puppies gently on an old flannel blanket he'd spread in the corner of the living room. The fireplace had long since gone unused, but today he built a small flame, not for warmth, but for comfort. The pups barely stirred, but the flickering light danced across their tiny bodies, casting shadows on fur and bone. He crouched down and studied them one by one. The dark-coated male with amber eyes and thick, oversized paws was the first to lift his head. His gaze met Jack's with startling steadiness. When Jack raised his hand slowly, the pup didn't flinch. He followed the motion like he understood it, like he'd seen it before. Jack nodded. "Blitz," he said. "You're sharp." The second pup, the sandy female, flinched at the creak of the floorboard as Jack shifted. Her eyes darted toward the door, ears twitching. She backed herself into the corner, watching. Jack paused, softened his breath, and waited. After a long minute, the pup inched forward and sniffed his boot. He held his hand palm up and whispered Hazel. Her coat was flecked with darker streaks down her spine like branches reaching through sand. And then there was the third one, the grayish-black male, with a small white patch like a crescent moon on his chest. This one didn't look at Jack. He looked at Emily, who sat cross-legged near the door, watching with her chin on her knees. The pup stood wobbled and crossed the room to her. Emily blinked, surprised, as he crawled into her lap, laid his head on her leg, and exhaled the kind of sigh that only comes from the desperate finding peace. Emily smiled softly. "Duke," she whispered, "you're mine." Jack stood slowly rubbing his shoulder. The old wound was acting up again, a deep, dull ache that came with cold weather and colder memories. He headed into the kitchen and returned with a shallow bowl of warm water and a washcloth. Gently, he began cleaning the grime from each pup, first Hazel, then Blitz. The process was slow, but none of them struggled. Hazel shivered at first, but settled under his hand. Blitz held still the entire time, watching Jack with unwavering focus. When he reached Duke, he noticed something. A scar. Small near the shoulder, almost hidden beneath the fur. Not a wound from nature, it was too clean. Like a microchip incision or an injection point. Jack's jaw tensed. That night, he cooked a plain chicken breast and tore it into small pieces, placing them in separate bowls. Blitz approached his food like a soldier. No hesitation, just precision. Hazel sniffed each bite before eating, constantly glancing toward the door. Duke waited until Emily encouraged him with a gentle nudge. Jack watched them quietly, the flickering fireplace casting soft light across the room. Later, when the house was still, Jack moved to his bedroom and lay down for the first time in what felt like days. The dreams came quickly. Fire, screams, the crack of falling beams, the heavy weight of a friend pinned beneath rubble. He jolted awake, breath-sharp sweat on his brow. But something was different. He wasn't alone. Blitz had crept into the room and lay beside the bed, eyes open, ears perked. Hazel was curled beneath the window. And Duke had wormed his way onto the mattress, tucked against Jack's side like a beating heart. For the first time in months, Jack fell asleep again. And this time, the fire didn't win. The next morning, Emily returned with her mother, Margaret Carson, a sturdy woman in her early 40s with iron-gray hair in a practical bun, and the kind of presence that filled any room without effort. She wore a navy scrub top beneath a denim jacket, and had hands that had delivered babies, closed eyelids of the dying, and comforted every patient between. Margaret stepped into the living room, took one look at the pups, and sighed. "So, this is what happens when I let you out of my sight for a few hours." Emily looked guilty, but Jack stepped in. She did the right thing. Margaret glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "And what's the plan?" "Keep them forever." Jack shrugged, "Long enough to get them healthy." "Jack." Her tone softened. "You're barely holding yourself together. Are you sure this is what you need?" He looked at the pups. Blitz was licking his own paw methodically. Hazel sat at the threshold, listening to a sound no one else heard. Duke rested his head on Emily's foot. Jack nodded. "I think maybe they're what I need." Margaret studied him for a long second, then crossed the room and knelt by Hazel. "Well," she said, her voice warming, "then let's get you three cleaned up properly." That afternoon, Jack made his promise. He stood in the yard watching as Emily tossed a tennis ball gently to Duke. Blitz sat beside him, eyes tracking every movement. Hazel sniffed the air, ears tilting toward the forest like radar. He spoke aloud, not to anyone in particular, but as if the sky needed to hear it. "You're safe now. You're not going anywhere. I don't know what happened to you before, but from this point forward, you're mine. I promise." And for the first time in a long time, when Jack looked into the eyes of those pups, he didn't see brokenness. He saw purpose. It was a wind-swept Thursday morning when Jack loaded Duke into the back of his old Dodge Ram. The sky over Flagstaff was a shifting canvas of gray and gold, the clouds rolling like waves against the San Francisco peaks in the distance. Emily sat beside Duke, her hand resting gently on his back. The pup didn't squirm or bark. He sat quietly, his ears-perked eyes focused on the movement of the world through the side window. Duke had been limping slightly for the past day, favoring his front right paw. It wasn't serious, but Jack didn't take chances. He knew how fast little things could become big ones when left ignored. The veterinary clinic sat at the edge of downtown, nestled between a faded thrift shop and a used bookstore. A hand-painted sign above the door read, "Evergreen Animal Care. Dr. Howard Fenley, DVM." The place looked like it had once been someone's house, and in a way it still felt like one. Dr. Fenley was in his early 60s, lean with angular features, and a full head of white hair kept tucked beneath a faded Arizona Cardinals cap. He wore wire-rimmed glasses and had a habit of humming low jazz tunes under his breath. Years of working with animals had etched permanent kindness into the lines around his eyes. Jack nodded politely as they entered. "Morning, Doc." Dr. Fenley looked up from a clipboard, eyes crinkling. "Well, well. Haven't seen you in a while, Jack. And who's this handsome devil? This is Duke. Found him a few days ago." The doctor's brow furrowed as he crouched to greet the pup. Duke allowed the examination, calm and still, though his eyes never left Emily. Fenley murmured approvingly, checking Duke's paw. "Just a sprain. Some rest, and he'll be fine." But as he reached behind Duke's left ear, his fingers paused. "Well, now what have we here?" He retrieved a small scanner from a drawer and waved it over the pup's neck. A soft beep filled the room. The screen lit up. Emily leaned closer. "Is that a chip?" Dr. Fenley's voice lowered. "Looks like it. But this one, it's not local." He tapped the screen. "Encrypted. Unusual format. I've only seen something like this once, years ago. Military contract. Law enforcement breeding program." Jack's eyes narrowed. "Can you get the data?" "Not here," Fenley said. "But I know someone who can." Later that afternoon, Jack drove Emily and Duke to the Flagstaff Public Library. They weren't there for books. They were there to meet Noah Alvarez, a 13-year-old with shaggy dark hair, round glasses, and the kind of intensity that made teachers love and fear him. Noah had a nervous energy about him, always tapping fingers or bouncing a leg, and he spoke fast as if his thoughts were always 3 steps ahead of his mouth. He and Emily had met during a school science fair months ago. She'd brought a volcano. He'd brought a drone that could track heat signatures. They'd bonded over being the weird kids who liked facts more than football. When Emily texted him about the chip, Noah showed up with a laptop, 3 cables, and a smile that said, "Challenge accepted." They sat in a quiet study room. Duke lay at Emily's feet while Jack stood in the corner, arms crossed, watching. Noah connected a portable chip reader to his laptop, then used custom software he'd built for a summer internship with the community college. Lines of code filled the screen like rain on glass. "Huh," he muttered. What Emily asked, "This chip's military-grade," Noah said. "Encrypted using an old K9 Tactical Protocol version 7. Not public. Not even civilian police units use it anymore." He typed a few commands. "There, got it. 3 IDs linked to the same batch." He paused. "All 3 of your dogs have chips from the same origin." He turned the laptop to face them. A logo appeared, Silver Wolf's head over crossed lightning bolts. Beneath it, K9 Vanguard Initiative, Batch 11B, status terminated. Jack stepped forward. "Terminated." Noah's voice grew quieter. "There's a timestamp. All 3 were marked for disposal 2 weeks ago, labeled as non-viable behavioral subjects. That means someone didn't think they were worth keeping alive." Emily's eyes burned. "But they're not dangerous. They're sweet." Jack rubbed his jaw, which means this wasn't about behavior. Someone wanted them gone. Quietly, Noah's screen flashed again. "Wait, there's more." The chip's metadata shows a last handler. A name, Connor Slate. He's registered as a breeder for Vanguard Initiative. His last location was a compound outside Prescott. Private facility. Jack had heard the name before once. Long ago. Slate had been a contractor who supplied dogs to fire departments and military programs. Rumors said he pushed dogs too hard, called the litters that didn't meet his standards. Jack had thought the program shut down years ago. Emily looked at Duke, now curled up in a perfect ball beneath the table. They didn't just abandon them, they erased them. That night, back at home, Jack couldn't sleep. Again. But this time it wasn't fire that haunted him. It was the image of Blitz staring up at him during training. Hazel's flinch when thunder rolled over the hills. Duke's refusal to leave Emily's side. Each pup bore invisible scars, not just of neglect, but of being engineered rejected and discarded, like tools thrown out for being slightly imperfect. Down the hall, Emily was awake too, reading about canine training programs and failed experimental litters. Her notebook now contained sketches of Blitz, Hazel, and Duke, each with notes: Blitz, tactical; Hazel, audio-sensitive; Duke, empath. She turned the page and drew 3 shields, one for each. Not failed, she wrote beneath. Just repurposed. Outside, the wind rattled the windows. Blitz stood at the back door staring at the trees. Hazel sat beside him, ears flicking alert. Duke, already in Emily's room, lifted his head once and settled back down. They weren't gone. They weren't broken. They were waiting. The sun had just begun its descent behind the peaks when the knock came at Jack's front door. The sky was washed in orange, and rose casting long shadows across the pine-draped yard. Jack, kneeling by a wooden fence he'd been reinforcing with fresh nails, paused mid-swing. Blitz, who had been lying nearby, perked up instantly, ears, straight eyes locked on the porch. Jack stood and brushed his palms against his jeans. Something about the timing dusk unexpected put a cold knot in his stomach. He walked slowly toward the front steps. Emily sat cross-legged on the porch, scribbling in her notebook, her hair falling in front of her eyes, as she tracked Hazel's behavior, who was stalking a moth around a flower pot. Duke lay at her feet, dozing lightly. The man standing on the other side of the screen door didn't look like a neighbor. He was in his late 50s, lean and angular, with slicked-back gray hair and a pressed tan blazer that didn't belong in the pine-heavy chill of the hills. His shoes were too clean. His smile was polite, but it didn't reach his eyes, gray, sharp, and calculating. A black SUV idled quietly at the edge of the gravel road. Jack Miller, the man, asked, voice smooth as polished wood. Jack didn't answer. Not yet. I'm with a recovery unit that works with retired government assets, the man continued. You recently came into possession of 3 German Shepherds. They belong to a discontinued program and must be returned. Emily stiffened behind him. Blitz had risen to his feet, stepping between Jack and the door, tail low, eyes locked. Jack narrowed his gaze. They were abandoned. No tags, no contact, no attempt to retrieve them until now. The man offered a thin-lipped smile. Mistakes were made, but we're here to correct them. You got paperwork warrants. The man's smile vanished. I'm asking as a courtesy. Jack stepped closer, voice firm. Then, here's my answer. No. There was a long pause. The man's hand flexed slightly. You're making this more complicated than it needs to be. Complicated's my specialty. Without another word, the man turned and walked back toward the SUV. The tinted window rolled up as it glided away, tires kicking gravel, disappearing into the woods like smoke. Jack stood motionless until the sound faded. That night the wind was strange. It howled not through the trees but around the eaves of the house. Jack moved from window to window, checking locks, closing curtains. He didn't say anything to Emily, but he kept Blitz close, the dog never straying more than a few feet. Hazel, ever skittish, refused to leave the hallway. Duke stayed curled against Emily on the couch as she scribbled in her notebook under the glow of a reading lamp. She had started calling it the Truth Book. Each entry was a day in the life of the dogs, what they ate, how they played, how they reacted to certain sounds, smells, commands. It wasn't just for fun anymore. It was evidence. If someone came for them again, she wanted the world to know who these dogs were, that they mattered. By midnight, the house had fallen silent. Emily was asleep with Duke at her feet, her journal resting on her chest. Jack stayed in the armchair near the window, Blitz at his side. A shotgun leaned quietly against the wall. It started with the soft clink of metal, faint, almost imagined. Blitz tensed, muscles coiled. Jack didn't speak. He just rose silently and moved to the back door. Hazel whimpered from the hallway. Jack cracked the door and stepped into the cold air. The motion light above the garage flicked on. Someone moved by the shed. Jack's boots barely made a sound as he crept across the dirt, Blitz a shadow at his side. They rounded the corner just as the figure of a man in dark clothing with a small flashlight reached for the latch on the shed door. "Hey!" Jack's voice cracked like a whip. The man spun, bolting toward the woods. Jack lunged forward, but Blitz was faster. He surged ahead, barking a deep, commanding sound that shook the air. The figure stumbled over a tree root, falling hard. He scrambled up, vanished into the tree line before Jack could follow. Blitz stopped at the edge, growling into the dark. Jack returned inside, heart pounding. He checked every lock again, every room. Nothing was missing. But something had changed. They weren't being watched anymore. They were being hunted. The next morning, Jack didn't go to work. He reinforced the windows, repositioned the couch, and moved Emily's room closer to his. He placed her notebook into a metal box with a lock. Then he called the sheriff's office, but no one could do much without a license plate or a name. All Jack had was a face. And that wasn't enough. Emily didn't ask why he suddenly started training the dogs with sharper commands, or why he now kept his phone charged and within reach. She didn't ask why he started caring again. But that night, after the dishes were washed and Blitz had finished pacing the living room, Jack sat beside Emily and told her something simple. "If anything ever happens to me, you keep that journal safe. You give it to someone who listens, someone who's not afraid." Emily nodded, and Duke pressed his head gently into Jack's palm as if to say, "I will too." The cold of late autumn began to settle over Flagstaff, threading between the pines like silent fog. The days grew shorter, the air thinner, and the quiet outside Jack's house held a certain tension, like the forest was holding its breath. Inside, however, the house was anything but still. It had become a place of purpose. Jack woke before the sun brewed strong coffee, and by dawn he was outside in the clearing behind the shed, hammering together makeshift training obstacles. Old tires turned into tunnels. Plastic cones borrowed from a neighbor's garage marked out courses, and lengths of rope strung between fence posts became agility lines. He hadn't planned it. It simply came to him, one memory at a time. Bits of old drills from his fire academy days, lessons learned from K-9 handlers he'd once trained beside. He wasn't just building a backyard course, he was building readiness. The dogs responded faster than he expected. Blitz, the dark-coated male, with the quiet focus of a seasoned scout, learned commands after a single repetition. He could sit, stay, crawl, and pivot on command, but his real strength emerged in scent tracking. Jack would bury a glove in a pile of leaves 20 yards out. Blitz always found it first. Hazel, the sandy-colored female with a streak of dark down her spine, was more cautious, but she picked up emotional cues like a whisper in the wind. If Emily was upset, Hazel would whimper and nuzzle her knee. If Jack's tone shifted even slightly in frustration or fatigue, Hazel would stop and lower her ears, refusing to move until his voice softened again. She was attuned to tension the way some dogs are attuned to thunder. Duke, the pup with the crescent-shaped patch on his chest, wasn't the fastest or the sharpest, but he was constant, loyal, steady. He took up position near doors, windows, and anywhere Emily sat like a living watchtower. He didn't bark much. He didn't need to. When someone approached the house, Duke was always the first to notice and the last to relax. Jack stood with his hands on his hips after a morning session, sweat beading on his brow despite the chill. The dogs panted happily, tails wagging, Blitz sitting at attention, Hazel rolling in the dirt, Duke walking circles around the perimeter. For a moment, Jack forgot about the chip, the stranger, the night someone tried to open his shed. He was a trainer again, a protector. Not just of himself, but of something greater. Inside, Emily had turned her notebook into a binder. She labeled each dog's section with colored tabs, filled it with behavior logs, sketches, and questions. One section read, "If they were defective, then why do they respond better than most dogs at the shelter?" Another note read, "Do dogs remember their past handlers, even when mistreated?" At school, her science teacher assigned a project on ethical treatment of animals in scientific research. Emily raised her hand and asked, "What about dogs trained by the government, who protects them when they're no longer useful?" That afternoon, she created a page called Voices for the Forgotten and posted a video online. It showed short clips of the dogs training intercut with her narration. They were bred for service, trained for silence, and then abandoned like trash. But they are not broken. They are not dangerous. They are worthy of love, protection, and a second chance. This is their story. The video went viral faster than anyone expected. People from across the state began commenting veterans who had served with K-9 units, dog trainers, rescue workers, even former employees of defunct training programs. Emily's inbox flooded with messages, encouragement, sorrow, and unexpectedly leads. One woman named Mara Eldridge, a retired K-9 handler living outside Phoenix, messaged Emily directly. She wrote, "I've seen what happens when dogs are deemed unfit. Sometimes it's not the dogs who fail, it's the system that breaks them." Emily read it aloud to Jack, who nodded slowly. They weren't alone anymore. That night, Jack added something new to the routine. He took each dog aside one by one, guiding them through personalized drills based on their strength. With Blitz, he created scent puzzles placing specific smells around the yard and commanding him to seek only one. With Hazel, he focused on body language, using subtle shifts in his stance to guide her movements. With Duke, he worked on environmental awareness, training him to recognize and respond to certain auditory cues, like a bell or a knock. It wasn't just training, it was trust. Trust rebuilt earned one look, one word, one motion at a time. Emily stood at the edge of the yard that night, notebook in one hand, phone in the other. She recorded everything, her voice narrating through the cool wind. These aren't just pets, they're survivors, soldiers without medals. And we're going to show the world what they really are. Inside, Jack sat by the fire looking at a folder of printed screenshots from Emily's post. He recognized one of the usernames that had commented anonymously, Connor S75. He stared at the screen for a long time. They were watching. But this time, Jack wasn't hiding. The first snow of the season came quietly, fine powder brushing over the treetops, settling into the creases of the old roof, coating the training yard with a hushed shimmer. Jack stood on the porch with a thermos in one hand and Blitz at his side, both staring at the barn across the property. It had once been his father's workshop, more storage than shelter now, with a sagging roof and faded red paint peeling off in patches. For weeks, Jack had avoided it. Not out of fear, but something closer to guilt. The barn had been his father's sanctuary, his retreat from the world after Jack's mother died. And though they had shared blood and a stubborn nature, their relationship had always been defined by silence and distance until the day Jack had left for the academy and never really came back. But something had changed. The night before, while looking through Emily's notebook, Jack had seen a familiar name, Slate. That name had surfaced in a contract he vaguely remembered his father once arguing about over the phone. And the idea had struck him as sharp and cold as the air. What if Dad knew? By noon, the snow had melted into the dirt, and the barn door creaked open. Jack stepped inside, flashlight sweeping through shadows and spiderwebs. Dust swirled in the beam like ghosts. The air smelled of cedar rust and old oil. He moved past the rusted tools and crates of spare fencing wire until he reached the back wall. There, beneath a tarp, sat an old wooden chest with brass corners and a tarnished lock. The initials W.M. were carved into the lid Walter Miller, Jack's father. He pried it open, the hinges groaning with age. Inside were folders, some water-damaged others wrapped in plastic sleeves. He pulled out a thick manila envelope labeled Vanguard, Batch Clearance 9B. The seal was broken, but the pages were intact. Dozens of files, training reports, medical scans, temperament assessments. At the top of one stack was a photograph of a German shepherd muscular, poised with a bold black mask over its face and eyes full of fierce intelligence. The name below the photo read, Sire Titan K9 Unit, Bravo Alpha 7. Jack froze. Titan. He remembered the name from an old news clipping, a decorated K9 who had saved a child from an IED blast during a school bombing in Aleppo. The dog had been awarded posthumous honors after succumbing to shrapnel wounds. But what hit Jack hardest wasn't the headline, it was the resemblance. Titan looked just like Blitz. Jack read deeper. Titan had sired a series of litters through Vanguard Initiative. But according to the attached memo, his final litter batch 11B was marked as inconsistent in emotional stability. The recommendation terminated at 8 weeks of age. Jack's fingers curled into fists. He kept reading and found a letter. Handwritten. The slanting cursive belonged to his father. I tried to speak up. They told me the dogs were tools, that if they couldn't conform, they were wasted investment. But they weren't tools. They were trying. They were afraid, and we betrayed them. I'm done. I'm walking away. If you ever find this, son, know that silence is never safer than truth. Jack sat on the floor of the barn back against the chest, the pages trembling in his hands. Blitz walked in a moment later, as if drawn by the memory of his own blood. He sat beside Jack and didn't move. Back at the house, Emily was in the living room scrolling through emails on her tablet. A user named Darla Finn had sent a link to a military archive. The message read, "You mentioned a dog named Blitz. You might want to look at this." Emily clicked the link. It led to a grainy photograph of a military ceremony. A child with a bandaged arm was holding a plaque, standing beside a man in uniform. Behind them sat a large German shepherd with that same bold black mask and powerful frame. The caption, Titan K9 Hero. Operation Silent Sky. Emily's eyes welled up. She clicked to the next photo, one taken during a training exercise. Titan sprinting across a field. And then, in another frame, him with puppies, 5 of them barely old enough to walk, one with an unmistakable white streak across his chest. Blitz, she whispered. She flipped to her notebook and added a new page titled, Legacy Doesn't End in Silence. When Jack returned that evening, his hands were stained with grease and dust. He handed Emily the folder and said, "My father trained them. He fought to protect them, and he lost." He looked at her. "But we don't have to." Emily nodded, already flipping through the documents, absorbing every detail like gospel. That night, Jack cleared off the kitchen table and laid out maps, training diagrams, and printed copies of Slate's past contracts. Blitz curled beneath the table. Hazel lay at Emily's feet. Duke, as always, positioned himself by the back door. They weren't just training anymore, they were preparing. The day began with wind, the kind that doesn't just blow, but whispers through the trees, unsettling the birds and making the pine needles shiver. Jack stood at the edge of the field behind his house, arms crossed, staring out toward the road that wound through Evergreen Hill like a snake waiting to strike. The dogs felt it too. Blitz paced the yard with taut steps, nose low to the ground. Hazel lingered near the porch, her ears twitching at every sound. Duke didn't move from his place near the front door, eyes fixed on the distant tree line. Inside, Emily sat cross-legged on the floor beside a low table stacked with papers and USB drives. Noah Alvarez, her tech-savvy friend with restless hands and oversized headphones, leaned over her laptop, lines of code reflecting in his glasses. He was 13, pale-skinned and skinny with a mop of black curls that bounced every time he muttered to himself. And today, he was cracking something dangerous. "Bingo," he whispered. Emily leaned in. "What is it?" Noah clicked through a series of government files hidden behind false subdirectories. "It's a grant ledger. Line item marked Special Asset Disposal. Behavioral Rejections, Batch 11B. Funded through Vanguard Initiative. Flagged for full termination, no shelter transfers, no reassignment, just elimination." Emily's voice dropped. So they were paid to kill them. "And someone approved it," Noah added, tapping the name J. Harland attached to the authorization. "Whoever that is, they're high enough to bury a file this deep." Before they could dig further, Hazel barked short, sharp a warning. Jack stepped out of the barn, eyes narrowing. At the end of the gravel drive, a black SUV rolled to a stop. Then another. And a third. The silence that followed was heavier than any wind. Doors opened. 3 men stepped out, all dressed in black tactical jackets with unmarked patches. They moved in formation, one carrying a silver case, another with a headset tucked behind his ear, and the third tall, square-jawed, and clearly in command. He had the kind of military posture you don't lose even years after service. Back straight eyes, cold, and hands that looked like they'd seen more than they said. Jack met them halfway down the drive, Blitz beside him like a shadow. "You've got 10 seconds to turn around," Jack said. The lead agent, whose name tag simply read N. Rourke didn't smile. "We're here to retrieve government property. 3 K-9 assets, unauthorized custody, flagged for breach of program protocol." Hazel now stood behind Blitz's low growl forming in her throat. Duke emerged from the house, positioning himself beside Emily and Noah like a silent wall. "They're not property," Jack replied, voice sharp. "They were discarded, left to die. Orders are orders." Whose orders? Rourke didn't answer. He nodded instead. The man with the case stepped forward and clicked it open, revealing a tranquilizer kit and GPS tags. That was when Blitz moved. He stepped forward, tail raised, stance protective. Hazel flanked him on the left, Duke on the right. None of them barked, not yet. They simply stood between Jack and the men, forming a perfect triangle. No fear, no hesitation. Rourke raised a brow. "Well trained. They trained themselves," Jack said. "When your system gave up on them." Emily came forward, now holding her tablet like a shield. "You can't take them. We have proof records, videos, financial logs. This isn't a recovery mission, it's a cover-up." Noah chimed in from behind. "I sent the files to Sheriff Boyd 10 minutes ago." Almost on cue, sirens cut through the air. A white sheriff's SUV pulled up behind the government vehicles. A woman in her mid-50s stepped out, tall and weathered, with short, silver-blonde hair and the calm confidence of someone who'd seen her share of chaos. Her name was Sheriff Nancy Boyd, and she carried herself like a woman who didn't care much for politics but cared deeply about justice. She had been a friend of Jack's since his academy days. They hadn't spoken much since his father passed, but her loyalty hadn't wavered. "Afternoon," she said evenly, stepping between the parties. "Got a call about possible unlawful seizure of property on private land." Rourke didn't blink. "These dogs belong to the Department of Defense." Boyd pulled a document from her coat and unfolded it slowly. "And this here is a temporary cease and hold order from the county judge, effective immediately. These animals are now under protection pending full investigation." Rourke's jaw flexed. "You have no idea who you're interfering with." Maybe not Boyd said, handing him the paper, but I know abuse when I see it. And I know how to read a budget line labeled disposal of minors. Noah grinned from behind Emily. Burn. Jack didn't smile, but the tension in his shoulders loosened. Rourke stared at the dogs for a long moment. Then, without a word, he closed the case and signaled his men. One by one, they retreated to their vehicles and drove off, tires grinding the gravel with quiet fury. After the last SUV vanished behind the curve of the hill, Jack let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Blitz nudged his leg. Hazel wagged her tail for the first time that day. Duke sat at Emily's feet, pressed into her calf. Boyd turned to Jack. They'll be back, but next time they'll need a judge's order. Jack nodded, and next time we'll be ready. That night, as snow returned to the hills in gentle flurries, the house was quiet. Emily updated her journal, adding the day's events beneath the title Evergreen Stand. She added a small drawing of Blitz, Hazel, and Duke, standing shoulder to shoulder, tails raised. They weren't just standing guard, she wrote. They were standing for something bigger. Like they knew this time no one was getting taken. The snow had melted by spring, but the cold truth of what had happened lingered longer than the frost. Evergreen Hill bloomed in pale green again, and with it came a kind of reckoning, not with fire or fists, but with voices, names, and the quiet power of not forgetting. It began with an email and a phone call. Sheriff Nancy Boyd, always blunt and direct, passed the message to Jack one morning as he repaired the fence near the back lot. Her voice on the line had been sharper than usual. The department's folding the Vanguard program. Internal audit. Public hearing scheduled in Phoenix. You might want to be there. Jack didn't hesitate. He packed his truck and drove down with Blitz seated tall in the passenger seat, head out the window, tongue lolling like he finally understood what freedom felt like. They arrived at the courthouse, not as protesters, not as soldiers, but as witnesses. The hearing room was pale and sterile, full of suits and solemn expressions. Jack wore an old denim jacket, his name stitched across the chest from firehouse days long gone. Blitz sat at his feet, calm but alert. The officials had insisted he remain muzzled. Jack declined. Sheriff Boyd backed him. So did Emily, who stood in the front row with Duke beside her, and a backpack full of documents, printouts, and photos. Noah had compiled a full digital folder of everything they'd uncovered: funding records, euthanasia orders, terminated batches. It was airtight. But the most powerful moment came not from the files. It came when Emily stood up and read aloud from her notebook. She was small behind the podium, her voice shaky at first, her brown hair pulled back in a loose braid. But as she spoke, her words gained weight. My name is Emily Carson. These dogs were left to die. Not because they were dangerous, but because they were different. And I believe that difference saved my family. She paused. I don't think Blitz, Hazel, or Duke were ever broken. I think they were waiting for someone to believe they were more than tools. And we did. The room fell still. Not one suit moved. By the end of the hearing, the department announced a full investigation. More than that, they proposed legislation, a federal mandate requiring ethical reassessment before any working dog could be classified as non-viable. It didn't erase what had happened, but it was a beginning. Weeks passed. Jack returned to Evergreen Hill not as a man looking over his shoulder, but as someone with a second mission. He'd received a letter from the Flagstaff Fire Department. The chief, a stout man named Hector Linwood, with deep lines across his face, and a gravelly baritone, had called Jack back not to fight fires, but to consult and help establish their new K-9 search and rescue unit. Thought you might want to work with someone who listens, the chief had written. We've seen your videos. That dog of yours, he's got something in him. Blitz became the first dog to wear the department's red search harness in over a decade. At his first drill, he found a buried volunteer in under 2 minutes. Meanwhile, Hazel's future took shape thanks to Margaret, Carson Emily's mother, who had quietly been bringing her to the hospital during evening shifts. At first, just for visits to the long-term care wing. But when Hazel placed her head gently in the lap of a woman with Alzheimer's, and the woman who hadn't spoken in weeks whispered, "You came back," they knew. Hazel belonged in healing. A local non-profit soon trained her officially as a therapy dog, and Duke never left Emily's side. He went to school with her wearing a vest that read, "Emotional Support, Dog in Training." But most of all, he lay by her desk every night as she wrote about the dogs, about their story, and about the kind of strength that comes from not giving up on someone just because they can't speak your language. Then came the ceremony. It was Emily's idea, her way of honoring the truth. She called it the naming. Flyers went out. Locals came, the mayor, veterans, students, kids with dogs on leashes, and old women with tissue-wrapped handkerchiefs. It took place on the green behind the library under the same sycamore tree where Emily once read books about heroes and never expected to become one. A stage was built from old firewood pallets and draped in bunting. Jack stood beside her, stiff but proud. Sheriff Boyd handed out the first certificate. Today, Emily said to the crowd, "We give names that were stolen back to the lives that carried them. We say them out loud, because silence is how they disappeared, and truth is how we bring them home." One by one, the dogs came forward. Blitz. Jack called his voice steady. Canine Search and Rescue. Flagstaff Fire Unit, born of Titan, trained by Hope, applause. Hazel. Margaret stepped forward, smiling for the first time in weeks. Certified Therapy Dog, Flagstaff Medical Center. Gentle, watchful healing. Tears now. Duke. Emily's voice cracked. Protector, listener, friend. The first one who sat still when I couldn't. The town clapped. Some cried. A wind passed through the trees, then soft and strange, like breath from something unseen. The dogs didn't bark, but they stood still facing the hill like they were remembering something only they could feel. 3 names, once discarded, now whispered into the wind. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't come with thunder or lightning. They come on 4 legs, with broken pasts and silent eyes that still choose to trust. This story reminds us that what the world casts aside God can still use for something powerful. Blitz, Hazel, and Duke were labeled as defective, forgotten by man, but never forgotten by the one who sees value in every life. Through love, patience, and faith, they found healing, and so did the people who chose to fight for them. In our everyday lives, we often overlook those who seem too quiet, too broken, or too different. But perhaps they are exactly who God has placed before us, not to test our strength, but to reveal our heart. This story is not just about dogs, it's about redemption, about purpose born from pain, and about how sometimes heaven speaks through those who cannot speak at all. If this story touched you, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe to our channel for more real-life stories of hope and healing. Type Amen in the comments if you believe every soul, human or animal, deserves a second chance. May God bless you for watching, and may He guide us all to be the kind of people who answer when someone cries, even if it sounds like a whimper in the woods.